For approximately 6 years, I've committed myself to solo wilderness treks. My familiarity with the backcountry is now deep enough that I often bypass established pathways, which in hindsight is probably the reason this entire incident occurred. This encounter took place in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia last October. I had driven north from Virginia, intending to spend a long weekend exploring the most secluded sections, far from any signs of other hikers. The climate was ideal, around the mid-50s I'd estimate. The sky was gray and clouded, but rain was absent. I anticipated finding true isolation. Roughly 4 hours into my journey, I arrived at what I can only term a ravine. It wasn't a gigantic chasm, but it possessed considerable depth, perhaps 30 to 40 feet down to a stony creek bed. Certainly not a guaranteed fatality if one slipped, but a definite injury. The steep banks appeared unscalable due to loose shale and significant overhang. A huge oak, ripped from the ground, lay tightly jammed between the two sides at a shallow angle. It was quite substantial. Its outer layer was polished smooth by the elements and likely previous traversers using it as a makeshift crossing. I assessed the log bridge for several minutes to confirm its stability, concluding it was reliable enough to support me. I moved slowly, focusing intently on my footing. I reached the far side without incident. And just as I regained solid footing, I registered a palpable burst of adrenaline from the precarious balancing act. That's when I detected a consistent, rhythmic thudding sound originating from behind me. I spun around. Standing on the opposite bank of the ravine, perhaps 10 feet from where the tree met the soil, was a man. He was clearly older, certainly in his 50s, dressed in a tattered camouflage jacket and aged denim. He sported a shaggy beard that made him resemble a classic logger archetype. It took me a moment to grasp what he had in his hands, a massive, full-sized felling axe. Perhaps he truly was a logger, but my mind was too stunned to process the thought. He walked directly to the root of the fallen tree and began striking it with the axe. I shouted over the gap, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. He didn't even lift his gaze, continuing the powerful, relentless blows. I watched in mounting panic as one of his swings bit deeper than the rest, causing the entire trunk to noticeably shudder. I shouted more fiercely, insisting he stop, informing him I had just used that tree to cross. I was suddenly certain he already knew that, and his objective was to maroon me here. Seeing no signs of cessation, I began hurling increasingly vitriolic insults at him, phrases that made little sense. I finally screamed that I needed to return to the opposite bank. At that, he finally raised his head to face me, uttering, "That poses no concern to me." The delivery was disturbingly bland, as if I had merely inquired about the temperature. His sheer indifference ignited my rage. I confess I lost a fraction of my composure, devolving into unrestrained screaming and vile personal attacks. I cannot recall the exact words, but one phrase must have struck a nerve, because he instantly ceased swinging the axe. He deliberately placed the tool on the earth before taking a few strides nearer to the precipice. I could now distinguish his features more clearly. It was not a pleasant sight. His eyes were deeply set and shadowed, almost as if the skin surrounding them was stained a darker hue. He leaned over the edge and delivered a statement that remains etched in my memory. "I am far more familiar with this forest than you are." The manner in which he spoke wasn't overtly menacing, yet it was undeniably absolute, like presenting an indisputable fact. We were locked in a staring match that felt eternal. Then he retrieved the axe, pivoted, and disappeared into the foliage. I had no response. What words were left? I remained in place, attempting to reconcile the bizarre encounter. The immense tree remained lodged in its position, but I could clearly see the edge on his side was splintered and fractured. I desperately wanted to go back immediately, but I could not risk my entire weight on that compromised crossing. I pulled out my mobile, only to confirm there was no signal whatsoever. I resolved to abandon the rest of my hike. I was certainly angry, but more importantly, I was truly terrified. I believe anyone in my circumstances would have felt the same. There was a profoundly unsettling quality to that meeting that defied explanation. I started moving along the creek bed downstream, theorizing I would eventually discover an easier place to cross, and that path would lead me in the general direction of my start point anyway. However, my assumption was entirely incorrect. I continued traversing for what felt like 60 minutes, and the ravine only continued to steepen and deepen. I also sensed the gap was expanding. I hoped for a crossing point, but each turn revealed worse terrain. Worse, the sun was sinking. Panic began. It was getting dark, and I was miles from my car in the wrong direction. I considered the insane idea of climbing into the gorge and out again. Then I found a campsite. It was a small clearing with a recently used fire pit. At first I was relieved, thinking a camper could help. But the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. Carvings were on the trees. Deep gouges, symbols, not initials. Weird objects lay around. Rusted tools, cloth on branches, animal bones in patterns. It was freaky. Seeing that, I immediately fled. I was twice as scared as before, which says a lot. Then it worsened. I heard sounds behind me stalking me, footsteps or something like them. Each time I spun, silence. I thought a predator tracked me. I sped up, hoping it would lose interest. But no, the sounds grew louder, closer. What happened next is the most terrifying thing I've ever known. The next sound, I glanced back for the 20th time and saw someone ducking behind a tree. A person. I froze, scanned the trees, and realized there wasn't just one. Another figure was further left. They'd fanned out. I was being herded. I don't know what made me realize they'd stopped hiding, but suddenly I heard them move more openly. I saw what looked like a pipe or club in one's hand. That was it. I just ran, knowing I couldn't play dumb anymore, and my dread came true. They chased me openly now, no longer stealthy. I can't explain the fear. I didn't even know what they wanted. I was deep in the woods, lost. Sun almost set. It felt like life or death, which explains my sustained speed. I ran faster than I knew possible. Faster than ever. One person behind me screamed. Not words, just screams. War cry screams. Nightmarish, I kept running. The gorge was still on my left. Just as exhaustion slowed me, I saw another fallen tree. Much smaller than the first, but no choice. Without thinking, I mounted it and started across. No time to check stability. Thinking now, I risked everything on that tree. The tension and fatigue were so intense, I honestly thought I'd slip it held. I made it across. As soon as I landed, I turned. 3 figures were following, all carbon copies of the first man who stranded me filthy. One held a pipe. I watched the first one touch the tree as if to cross. Then he stepped back. The 3 looked at me menacingly, and again I couldn't move. Then one told me to get out, that I was lucky. That was all I needed. I turned and fled. I expected to hear them, but the forest was eerily quiet. The darkness didn't help. I fought full breakdowns a couple times. I must have angled back toward the trailhead, or I got impossibly lucky, but I found it. I reported what I could after driving home, but I knew nothing would be done. Months passed. I still hike, but it's less enjoyable. I truly hope to enjoy it again. Hiking was my favorite, but now the experience always intrudes. It was just so freaky. The first guy with the axe especially. His look when he spoke, as if he knew my fate. He probably did. He likely orchestrated it all. It terrifies me to think I could have died that day. It was profoundly disturbing. That first man with the axe especially. The way he looked at me, speaking those things as if he knew my exact fate. He likely did. Hell, he probably planned it all. It frightens me to consider I could have died in those woods that day. This occurred 3 years ago. I know many prolonged tales, but I see no need. So I will simply recount events exactly as they happened. I was trekking a remote forest section in northern Minnesota. Far from any trails, I always favored it this way. The true wilderness, not the sanitized version of popular trails with markers and worn paths. Just me in the woods. As intended, I'd been out maybe 4 hours when I noticed I was disoriented. It happens off trail, but I usually quickly find my bearings. This time felt different. Nothing looked familiar. The sun was still high, so no immediate danger, but that sick feeling of being lost already settled. I tried to stay calm walking, telling myself I'd soon see something familiar. Instead, I detected a rustling sound behind me. The last thing one wants in my situation. The rustling wasn't constant. Just every 30 seconds or so, as if matching my pace, I'd halt. It halted. I'd walk, There it was again. I kept telling myself it was likely a deer, but I'd hiked enough to know deer don't follow like that. I pressed on, fairly certain I was being stalked. Then suddenly the rustling became movement all around me. A worst-case scenario. By the time I grasped what was happening, it was too late. I was encircled by a wolf pack. 6 or 7, I'd guess. Some snarled, others stared. But to them, I was clearly prey. I wouldn't yield without a fight. My knife was out. I knew the odds were against me. Yet I remember thinking, this is it. This is truly how I'll die. Alone in the woods for being too stubborn to use marked trails, I was deciding whether to appear large, stay still, or what. Then every single wolf stiffened simultaneously. Not reacting to each other, but to something else. Their ears shot up, all looking in the same direction, somewhere over my shoulder, and then they simply scattered. Scattered as in a full sprint in the opposite direction from where they'd been looking, almost as if they were the hunted. That's when genuine fear truly set in. Until that point, it had been a wild adrenaline rush, understandable given the life or death situation I believed myself in. But once alone, the creeps began. The first thing I noticed after the wolves vanished was utter silence. No wind, no birds, no critters, nothing. It was like a switch flipped. It was still daylight, but things felt dimmer, like vision fading from fatigue or before fainting. But the worst part was why the wolves fled. They were scared, that much was clear. But what could terrify an entire pack from afar? I couldn't fathom. I needed to move, but felt deeply unsettled. Even in daylight, I almost wanted to follow the wolves, but I was fairly certain I'd been heading the right way initially. So I faced a dilemma. Follow the wolves, potentially to be encircled again and get more lost, or continue in the correct direction and possibly encounter whatever scared them, an impossible choice. I ultimately decided to keep walking the way I thought led out of the woods, meaning toward what had spooked the wolves. My logic: I could waste an hour following the wolves only to turn back in the dark, or just face it while light remained. So I did. About 20 minutes later, I saw what appeared to be a clearing ahead. For a second, I thought it might be a campsite. I saw what looked like a fire ring, but closer I realized it was wrong. All wrong. Symbols carved into the trees around the clearing, not initials or trail markers. These were deliberate, deep cuts forming unfamiliar patterns. It worsened. Things hung from branches on what looked like leather cords. Some were bones, small, perhaps birds or rodents. Others were rusted metal, twisted into painful shapes. The fire pit wasn't just a stone ring. The stones were delicately stacked, like structures. The fire pit held peculiar items too: fabric scraps, what appeared to be jewelry, and other unidentifiable objects. But this truly terrified me: the smoke. A thick black cloud hung in the air, about 6 feet from the ground. It remained motionless, undissipating, and didn't seem to originate from the fire pit. It just existed. I genuinely wish I could claim it was merely residual smoke from the pit, yet the pit itself didn't look recently used. I stood at the clearing's edge, utterly immobilized. For some inexplicable reason, I couldn't tear my gaze from that smoke. My eyes consistently returned to it. Even when I attempted to focus elsewhere, I struggled to articulate the sensation. But it felt as if I observed something through a pane of glass rather than being physically present. Like I was peering from my kitchen window into the backyard, instead of actually being in the backyard. I don't fully comprehend its meaning, but that was the feeling. A peculiar sensation welled in my chest, a fusion of sorrow and dread. Yet for some reason, the actual event hadn't happened. It was almost as if my physical being grieved in advance. I have never experienced such a feeling, before or since. I must have stood there for 5 minutes, fixated on that smoke, before a part of my mind finally reactivated. And no, the smoke didn't vanish in that time. It simply remained. I eventually mustered the courage to turn and flee. I didn't walk or jog. I literally ran, overwhelmed by terror. I didn't know what I was escaping, but an instinct told me I needed to exit the forest. My recollection blurs thereafter. I suspect it's due to the intense fear. So terrified that my instincts took control. But a part of me believes the memory loss was somehow linked to whatever the hell was in those woods. the smoke, or its source, or something else entirely? I don't know. My next distinct memory is of darkness, meaning I must have been in those woods for another hour or so. I was drenched in perspiration and bizarrely freezing cold then, but I was nearly out. I approached my vehicle. I entered and drove away without a second thought, and that was all. I never reported my discovery. What would I even report? I couldn't locate that clearing again if I tried, and that's assuming my memory was clear, which it wasn't. This will forever be one of those unexplainable experiences. When I shared it with my father, he simply said everyone encounters such a thing eventually. Well, this is mine. And the one thing I still ponder occasionally isn't the wolves' behavior, the campsite's appearance, or even that impossible suspended smoke. It's the memory loss. From all my research, terrifying moments are remembered more vividly, not less. So I am forced to conclude that everything that day was interconnected. Back in my youth, my friends and I loved camping. Once we obtained our licenses at 16, we were out almost every weekend, exploring new sites. Our parents largely permitted it, provided we could defend ourselves. For this reason, my father allowed us to borrow one of his firearms. It was a Taurus G2C. This incident occurred when we were 18, seniors in high school. That February, my girlfriend Megan, my friend Colin, and his girlfriend Ann planned a road trip to Arkansas to backpack the Ozarks and view some natural waterfalls. It was a 9-hour drive from our home, so we departed early, arriving around 7 p.m. We established camp at a designated site for the night, given the late hour and our fatigue. My girlfriend and I shared one tent, and Colin and his girlfriend shared another. The gun was in my tent. Nothing noteworthy happened on the first night. The next morning we awoke, prepared breakfast, and drove to the trail's starting point. Our plan was to hike to a waterfall, then find a suitable place to set up camp. On the trek to the waterfall, Anne repeatedly claimed she saw someone standing motionless, staring at her, but he had been following without her seeing him move. So we paused to observe and saw a man quickly retreating. Colin yelled for him to leave or face consequences, likely a show of bravado for his girlfriend. We were, however, capable of self-defense if necessary. We continued our hike and did not see him again. We eventually reached the waterfall, where we ate lunch and took photographs. After approximately 2 hours, we decided to locate a campsite before dusk. While searching for a spot, I noticed an unnaturally tall, slender woman staring at us. She must have been at least 6 feet 5 inches. It genuinely unnerved me. I pointed her out, and everyone else also became uneasy. We shouted at her to leave us alone, mentioning we possessed a gun. She turned and departed. We chose to hike further, as we were all profoundly creeped out. We had no idea if these two strange individuals were connected. After another 60 minutes, we found a pleasant spot beside a flowing brook with a fairly deep pool. So we chose to enter the water and unwind. While splashing around, we discussed the earlier occurrences, joking they were probably intoxicated hillbillies. As the sun began to descend, we decided to exit and prepare supper. We brought chicken breasts for grilling, rice and vegetables for boiling, and some potatoes. Our campouts always featured good meals. While I handled the cooking, Colin erected his tent and assisted with mine. I finished preparing food, and we ate before opening some of the alcoholic beverages we'd brought. I was, and remain, a fairly heavy smoker, so I had weed and rolling papers. We aimed for a good time, having invested significantly in this excursion. We exchanged tales and laughed in our inebriated state. It reached a point where Colin tumbled from his chair and simply lay on the ground, roaring with laughter. We continued this late into the night, eventually retiring to our tents. Megan and I were engaged in recreation inside our tent when we suddenly heard someone laughing outdoors. Initially, I assumed it was Colin, laughing at us for some reason, so I shouted, "What's amusing?" Colin yelled back, "That wasn't me." That revelation chilled me to the core, instantly sobering me. I seized the firearm, burst from the tent, and discharged several shots into the air, ordering the unknown individual to depart or face being shot. That appeared effective, as I heard footsteps rapidly retreating. We relocated our tents closer together and resolved to have one person stay awake on watch duty at a time. The following day, we debated returning home early, but ultimately decided against it. We were confident we had frightened off whoever it was, so we planned to trek somewhere nearer the exit and camp for one final night. After breakfast, we packed up our camp and began the return hike. During the trek, we encountered other hikers and recounted our experience. They too were alarmed. We conversed briefly, then proceeded. When we stopped for lunch, I realized those were the only other people we'd seen thus far, despite the parking lot having been full earlier. After lunch, we continued down the path, and after about 6 miles, we decided to establish camp. We were roughly 3 miles from the nearest exit. We pitched our tents and cooked steak and potatoes for our evening meal. We ate, drank, and smoked again before retiring to the tents. In the dead of night, I awoke, needing to urinate, so I stepped outside the tent. Out of paranoia, I ensured I brought the gun. While relieving myself, I heard nearby leaves crunching. My heart instantly seized. I grabbed the gun, finished up, pulled up my trousers, and activated my headlamp. The beam illuminated the man from the previous day, standing in the distance, brandishing a machete. I could see him clearly this time. Long, filthy black hair, and exceedingly lanky. I screamed and raised the gun as he began charging at me. I discharged every round I had, and must have struck him somewhere, because I heard him cry out and saw him fall. By now, Colin, Megan, and Anne were all awake. I instructed them to pack quickly. We needed to leave fast. I didn't want to involve the police, uncertain if I could face charges for something, and honestly, his life didn't seem worth the risk. We didn't bother packing the tents, as there was no time. We grabbed our bags and practically sprinted the final 3 miles, reaching the cars in under an hour. We climbed in, locked the doors, and resolved to sleep in the vehicle for the night. We covered the windows and attempted to rest. Upon waking in the morning, we departed immediately, stopping for breakfast at a diner in a small town. We never contacted the authorities, and I'm still conflicted about whether we should have. This happened years ago, and no reports about it ever surfaced. So for all I know, those deranged individuals are still at large.